Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today. Today we are focusing on talking with an expert about diagnostic reading assessments. This is in a series of webinars all related to the science of reading. I am Margaret Opatz, a reading research scientist for CAPTI, and I will be your host and facilitator for today's webinar. Today we will ask an expert, Dr. John Sabatini, about diagnostic reading assessments. And in today's session, we hope that you will be able to clarify some of the uses of diagnostic reading assessments. So yes, we're excited to have you here. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our expert today. Dr. John Sabatini is a distinguished research professor at the University of Memphis, and he's formerly a lead researcher at ETS. At ETS, he led the development of multiple pre-K to 12th grade reading assessments as part of the IES-funded Reading for Understanding initiative. Dr. Sabatini is internationally known for his research on reading literacy development, assessment, and cognitive psychology. So given his expertise, we are sure to learn all we need to know about diagnostic reading assessments. And I just want to say, Dr. Sabatini, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Yes, and then
I'm really interested in the session on fluency too. It's another area I'd like to dabble in.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, love to talk about that more. So just as a quick overview of today, we'll start by learning a bit about Dr. Sabatini and his work surrounding reading research, and then we'll really dig into diagnostic reading assessments through a series of questions related to reading assessments. And then we'll actually take a look at a diagnostic reading assessment that Dr. Sabatini developed, and then we'll leave some time for questions and answers. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen here and let's jump in. So Dr. Sabatini, can you start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself and like how you became a reading researcher?
Sure. I did my graduate work at the University of Delaware with someone who's in the Reading Research Hall of Fame. There is such a thing in Dr. Richard Diagnostic. And as part of that, he with Dr. Wagner at the University of Pennsylvania formed the first National Center on Adult Literacy. And I then moved on to work at the University of Pennsylvania in that center. And I've been studying literacy from history, social foundations, and psychology. And the psychology included, cognitive, psycholinguistic, and ed psych. And what I was forced to do is study all about children and adolescents and try to apply it to adult literacy learning. And that continues to this day. I think at the end, we might talk a little bit about adults. But it prepared me well for, basically becoming immersed in reading research. And that just continued when I went to Educational Testing Service in the Research and Development Division and to this day.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. So I know you've had a long history within reading research, but what currently excites you about the field of reading?
Excites me or scares me? I mean, we could spend the entire time talking about technological advances and what they're going to bring to us all. But I think what I thought I'd mention today is I'm kind of excited that there's a greater grassroots attention and sort of less automatic resistance to what's called science of reading. I mean, I don't think the politics around it are over. I mean, reading wars have raged for decades in this country, but at least we're at a moment where, the general notion that educators and schools might apply the best research practice findings to their practice is promising. And it's allowing for sessions like this where we just talk about whatever the research tells us might be useful and might work. As a researcher, it kind of makes my life a little easier and my research a little better. because I found over the years that you'd often spend a lot of time trying to explain even why you were conducting this research, and not infrequently reaching a lot of either active or passive resistance about what you were doing. And I don't give researchers a free pass on this. I think I have a lot of colleagues in the science of reading history, and they were often kind of scolding or preachy about it. So I don't think they were doing a very good job of messaging out there. And I think, though, that that's also turned around nicely. So I think that gives everybody an opportunity to, both do good research and good practice, and that will accelerate, hopefully, our ability to help children learn and adults to learn to read.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, what makes you, or like what, from your perspective, has kind of like propelled the science of reading forward, like kind of made it like not something that people are like vehemently against, but kind of like starting to believe in?
Yeah, I don't know, but I think I I might actually have to credit all the ed tech producers out there a little bit, because again, the researchers to this day are not always good communicators. The core group. I mean, there's plenty that work directly, were teachers, work directly with educational systems, but I think the framing of issues the way a CAPTI would, or the way any of the other producers do, is much more open, and it invites people in and allows them to just evaluate it, the content and the professional development on their own. I also think there's just been some good success stories out there. I think Mississippi applied it very effectively and wasn't afraid to say they were using science of reading methods. And so there were enough instances out there of both success and sort of, that's me just trying to read the tea leaves of what I'm seeing. I'm just happy it's right now. Okay, now there's a lot of legislation being passed in a lot of states, and I'm not sure, again, that makes it a trigger point again. And so I hope that it doesn't end up, again, becoming much more political and much less about the science of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that kind of leads me to the next question I had for you is like, what is the biggest challenge that the field of education faces today?
And that kind of moves me a little bit back to the tech side. I'd say it's the intelligent adaptation to individual differences, both in differentiating instruction. Some students are going to respond better to different kinds of instruction. The science of reading doesn't say there's only one way to teach reading. It says, this works better for most under these conditions. How much practice and accommodating different growth trajectories. There's no reason to believe, and we've never seen everybody learn exactly on grade level all the time. And so it's exciting because we have all kinds of technologies, we have all kinds of data capture now to do, a much more sophisticated job of directing quality instruction and the amount of it and frequency of it to students with our technologies. I think the challenge is that the historical structure of school, an organization isn't adapted to that kind of flexibility yet. And that's the probably challenge we face over the next period of time. It's no longer technological limitations forcing us to do things in awkward ways. It's now institutional structures that are not yet flexible enough to handle the new level of information we have.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in the media right now about that, how to kind of harness that rather than be afraid of the technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's only one possible, I don't even want to call it a silver lining, but the pandemic did accelerate the acceptance and understanding of how to do remote and digitally based communication. Obviously, we're here today using it in a way that just 3 years ago, 4 years ago, most people would have shied away from. It would not be so prevalent. And I think that's actually helped. That has helped, get technologies into the school in a much richer way.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing about that. So I'm going to kind of like change subjects slightly, but I want to jump into your work with diagnostic reading assessments. So I know for decades that you have researched reading literacy and assessments. And I just want to give you some context to this question. So in a recent survey that we conducted, we found that there's some confusion surrounding the various types of reading assessments. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, can you kind of just share with us, like, what are the different types of assessments and how do we choose which assessment to use? And yeah, like what kind of advice could you give us on that?
Sure. So, your audience, of course, knows that like any good interview, you're not doing gotcha. You prepared me with some of the questions.
For sure.
And so I've prepared a slide for this one. That's actually, I had to dig out because I haven't used it in a while, but I think it's still relevant and I don't think that it's changed. And so I'm going to share screen. Pop it up to full. Work. Can you see that?
Yep, I can.
So I think the real key to understanding different kinds of assessments is to focus yourself on, the purpose of the assessment. Why? And in the last column you see here, what would I do with the results once I got them? It's really not about what's inside the assessment till you understand those two things. And so the general types of assessment that you'd see in reading in a classroom, and there's a broader set of these if you were to go to, say, other kinds of testing like certification. But within the classroom, you do something called screening. That would be usually before you start your instruction. That would usually just give you a small, quicker snapshot of your group. And what you're trying to do is either identify students who already might benefit from additional testing or other kinds of things, and then maybe some grouping of students by whatever the screener is sort of identifying, or at least provisional grouping. The next one, which I guess we'll talk about most, is diagnostic and using that to get profiles of students. And here, within the world of reading that I've worked on a lot, you can break it up into sort of basic or foundational skills, fluency, as you mentioned, the development of fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, somehow didn't make it to its own line, sentence level, and discourse. And here, and this is where I get to what's the sort of challenge moving forward, but also the opportunities. It's allowing you to adapt and tailor instruction to align better with learner needs at the moment. And then generally the category of formative assessment, which is the idea that the teacher would give on the spot classroom assessments as they're going along. These can be used to sort of check, is my instruction working more generally, or are there things that everybody's not getting that I need to shift on? They're intended to be more informal. And then a class that might be called sometimes formative, but it's because it's coming from outside and they're usually kind of formalized, is monitoring or benchmark assessment. And again, those kind of come in two flavors, I think. The one flavor is where they're giving you basically the same kinds of tasks that you'd see on, say, the final outcome or the state test. So they're just seeing whether you're sort of making appropriate progress towards those. And again, if you see kids lagging way below, you move them, you're looking to say, okay, what's going wrong? More diagnostics, more intervention. And then, the final type is this sort of outcome measure. I think schools mostly rely these days on their state tests. Districts sometimes have tests, it's really, but that's the one that, you're looking at to see that they're making progress on the major thing you're interested in, which is typically comprehension. So that's your comprehension test or literacy test. That might also be your standards-based test. Because and I'm just saying, I don't 100% equate achieving standards with reading. They're highly overlapping, but there are some things in literacy language arts standards that are about the language arts that a reading researcher may or may not say, well, you need that to be a good reader, or you need that to be a proficient reader. It's handy, but it's not mission critical. But if it's in the standards, it's mission critical. So I don't know, you might think of literary devices. I like everybody to learn and be able to use literary devices. You don't necessarily see reading comprehension tests that say, what's a simile for blank? That's a state standards test. So
Yeah.
leave that up for a moment if you have questions.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great overview of the various types of assessments. So now, because we are here today to really dig into the diagnostic reading assessments, I'm curious to know, why would you suggest a school or a teacher use diagnostic reading assessments?
Ooh, I don't know if all the audience is familiar with the National Assessment of Educational Progress results or the various international tests such as PISA or PEARLS. I'll just start with the NAEP that I'm familiar with. Nearly 40%, I think, of fourth graders fall either literally below basic, and another 30% are at the basic level. And I would not be satisfied if my own child, fell in that level in terms of being a skilled reader.
Mm-hmm.
I say that for anybody. I mean, no one should be satisfied that someone goes through our education system only to reach the basic level of reading proficiency. And that's 2/3 of our nation. Now, if it were only comprehension, and you could therefore focus back your instruction only on those skills, the framework used to measure comprehension, then you wouldn't necessarily need diagnostic tests. But underneath those scores are actually a whole multidimensional set of skills, components, processes that develop over years, any one of which could actually be the underlying cause is too strong a word, could be one of the nested problems that good instruction could help with if you target it, and might not self-remediate. You want me to share a slide that, again, that I think might point out the complexity here?
Yes, please.
This is see if it's, yeah. So some of your viewers may be familiar with Hollis Scarborough's Strand. It's very interesting. I've known Hollis for years. She always described this not as a model, not as a theory, but simply as a heuristic for professional development. I think the people in the reading research community think it's much, much more than that. And you can argue with the details, but I think the general concept of this is still very, very powerful. It basically says, well, you have all this language components that you have to develop across time. I mean, you don't develop all your vocabulary in 1 year, you develop it over your lifetime. your ability to handle more and more complex language structures, the background knowledge you need to interpret what you read and to make inferences. And then on the print side of it, you have a whole set of other skills that you're learning, the ability to see a novel. I mean, I do adult literacy, so I'm always saying to people, well, yeah, you think of decoding as saying, cat had or whatever. I think of it as knowing the difference between modern and Moderna, the Pfizer, and various words that you're going to see for the first time that you have to be able to build into your vocabulary. You need to sound them out. You need to match them with words you know. You need to use them. You need to accumulate this vocabulary over time, and the other skills you see here. The thing is, and this goes back to what I says, you need to sort of reach a threshold level of each of these because instruction stops on them, say, after elementary school. So what happens is you hit 3rd or 4th grade, you're not fluent, or you don't really have good word recognition skills because the curriculum and the teaching kept moving, but they may not have given you enough time or enough resource to get to a level where those would continue to develop in spite of the fact that there's no direct instruction on them. And that's true for most skilled readers. Those who become skilled readers. So you don't have to keep teaching decoding or explicit vocabulary to most 6th graders. But those who never kind of consolidated all the skills up to that point, that's actually the bottleneck, or it could be the bottleneck to them making progress. In fact, we have very good research suggesting it is a bottleneck for many students. And that goes back to my issue about different trajectories. It may be that they just learned or needed more practice or needed some different things going on. The point is, though, that the school and the standards and the content of text all moved on without them. And now they're basically playing catch up. So a diagnostic model allows you to identify if there's any of these things that are bottlenecks in the system. The empirical research already tells us if you teach them, they should learn, with the caveat that if they have a reading or learning disability, it either may take longer, and if it's very severe, it may take alternate methods. But as a rule, if you go back and you really address these things directly, now you'll see progress on everything. I'll put out one other feature that I kind of like to do. So when you start out, all these things are kind of separate. And I think what fools people that become good readers is how they all get integrated so that by the end, when I look at a text, all I see is meaning. I don't see all these little components operating in my consciousness. And that's a good thing. And that's the increasingly automatic part of this. Since I no longer hear myself decoding. I no longer see just the words. I'm thinking in comprehension. And it's not like all those operations stopped. If you looked at the neural cognitive machinery, I mean, there's an engine there that's basically looking, I love saying this, somebody criticized, why do you keep saying it? Because the eye tracking research shows that you see 4 words per minute, your eyes move to 4 spots per minute, per second, I'm sorry. So you're recognizing words a 1/4 second each. Long words, short words, words you've never seen before. And so you're computing these computationally quick movements of your eyes to do this. You occasionally go back to check something. All this stuff is happening inside your head with very complex text while you're understanding it, but you're not aware because that's what your brain's for. It's for computing these complex things based on the accumulation of knowledge and skills. If you look at a less skilled reader with these other issues, that breaks down. And so you don't get this nice tight, oh, it's all comprehension. You get a lot of attention and energy put into the little pieces, which makes the whole system a little bit less efficient and to the point where it just breaks down. You're not a good comprehender.
Yeah, I wonder, so we have a question from the audience, and I think that what you were just talking about really does relate to this. So The audience member is asking, how are basic or proficient on NAEP actually interpreted? Like, can you give us some insight? Like, what would that mean to be at a basic or proficient level?
Sure. Uh, you look up the exact language, but the basic level generally means you can read a passage that's somewhere around your grade level. And in NAEP, they actually do both long and short passages. So you may be reading a whole story as a passage at a 4th grade and 8th grade and 12th. So, not a, no offense to some test makers, not this much text. We're talking about really reading. You can do 3 general cognitive operations. You're building a just understanding of it. You're making interpretations and inferences about what's happening at, they separate into the literary and informational. And so you're generally able to draw conclusions about it. You're reasoning about it to some level. So you're sort of running a whole bunch of things you're capable of doing. So at the basic level, you're basically able to kind of understand what you read and answer some basic inferential questions about that passage. You're not doing a lot of the more complex evaluative analytic kinds of operations that we also expect of children at every grade level, particularly. And so that's what the difference between, say, basic and proficient is. In research we did based on a special reading fluency at 4th grade, up to half, I think it was up to half or 30% of those at the basic level are actually reading slower than you'd like, which might speak to less than consolidated foundational skills. And so that might be a reason, that might be one of the reasons for their poor lower comprehension. But most at the basic seem to have their foundational and their fluency down. They're just not able to do a lot of the comprehension skills and strategies that one also expects them to be able to do.
Okay. So I think that's a great overview. And it kind of leads me into this next question. So like, if you did have a student who's like scoring basic on like the state assessment, you might use a diagnostic assessment. And I guess I'm curious, like what type of skills should the diagnostic reading assessment really focus on?
Well, again, we've settled in, and that's the measure you CAPTE is using on 5 or 6 that I think represent a psycholinguistic model of reading and language development. We look at we combine decoding and word recognition together. Maybe later, if we have a moment, I'll show you why I think that's legitimate. Although it's very funny that I just remembered I was at AERA, and there's a group out, I think it was Stanford, I'm not sure. And they were using, when I started this, there was this thing in psychology called a lexical decision test. So a lexical decision test would give you a word that could be, I guess, pronounced or a real word, and then something that was like a letter string that just didn't make any sense, and you'd make a forced choice. And then there was another kind that made you force choice between a word that's spelled right. So there was all these. And so, they knew of the way that we address word recognition on the ReadBasix. And by the way, which the original model for this came from Hollis Scarborough. This was actually one of her designs. And they said, well, why did you do it that way? And I said, well, because we could explain to people what was going on. We said, sometimes you have to recognize real words, and you recognize them very quickly because you've seen them before and you know them, and it's automatic. Sometimes you're going to see a word that you haven't seen before, but you've heard, so you don't recognize the spelling. So you have to match it in your head to the words you've heard so that you can connect the spelling and the orthography to the sound in your, because you want to amalgamate those codes, those different codes and the meaning. And then sometimes you're going to see words that just, really at least up until this point, have never been a word for you and are not words. And so, and I think Pfizer falls into that. Okay, eventually they'll become a word, but at the moment you see them, they're just, you've never heard them before. This is the first time you're ever seeing them. You need to create a pronunciation, basically, but it doesn't match anything. So that's a 3 operations you have to do. And if they ask me, well, why'd you do it that way? I said, well, because I couldn't give them lexical decision test, because I couldn't hide behind the idea that this was all brain science, which is the way they market it now, and therefore people will do anything you want. I had to actually explain to them why it makes sense. And I think that still holds. I mean, what you do in that task is what we all have to do as we read, every day. And so I think it's got a certain sense of authenticity to it, even though it's a kind of artificial task. So word recognition, biggie, and decoding goes with that, meaning recognizing words recognize words you've never seen before, but heard, recognizing words and pronouncing words you've never seen or heard before. Vocabulary, which accumulates across your lifestyle, your life. And again, this is a kind of almost exponential growth across 12 years. You're going to go from zero to, well, not zero, but several thousand words are in most texts to 10, 25, 75,000 words. Estimates are always weird this way, but by the time you get to high school and college, you've got a lot of different words you have to be able to recognize really quickly, really well, and know their meaning. Morphology in
And
English.
John, I'm just sharing this slide because
Sure.
Some of our audience members may not be familiar with ReadBasix.
That's great.
Yeah, I just wanted to share.
Keeps me focused.
Yeah, these are the skills.
Morphology, again, is one of the great vocabulary growth, and it's the link between continuous text understanding and word meaning. And, it really should be called morphosyntactic, because you can only use certain words in certain sentence frames. I can say, I am not unhappiness, about this. So the frame of the sentence dictates the kind of, especially the suffix. It also means that once you learn one form of a word, you have the potential to learn the whole family. So decided, decisive, undecided, etc. So morphology and just all the academic content words fall into complex morphological families. So it's not only the simple thing, which or the inflectional, as they say, which is ED, S, simple forms, which can be very challenging, especially for English language learners. But it's also this derivational form where you're basically changing the meanings with these morphological affixes and words. Sentence processing, a lot here has to do with what we call logical connectors. So there's a difference between a sentence that says, if he went to the movies, then he was going to do this, or but he went to the movies and he did this, et cetera, et cetera. So those help you to create much more richer meaning. Reading efficiency gets at, you're going to get a lot of text as you get older, and especially in an academic setting. You're going to read chapters of books are getting longer, et cetera. I think you need to be reading at the speed of language. I think others have written that. Actually, Mark Seidenberg has a great book which says something like language at the speed of what is it? The speed of language or speed of light or something. But it's the idea that your brain is set up to be able to handle comprehension processing at the speed I'm speaking. Well, if it can do it for speaking, it can do it for reading. Actually, good readers read about 20 to 40 words per minute faster than they can listen. You could speed up speech and they would still understand. And when they are reading on their own, they can go faster. And then basically we look at, in ours, basic comprehension, which takes away all those higher order, really complex reasoning, thinking about the text. Saves them for later. They're absolutely important. You want to see you can do them, but we focus in on just, did you get the basic gist of it? Did you make simple inferences to connect coherently the text in front of you? So it's sort of comprehension light. Now, I'll add one that you don't currently test, sorry, but I would do many of these things in the oral language channel too, because they don't only develop through print. And therefore you want to see that the entire language channel is developing. So I think as we go into the future, more and more, you'll want to also see how this is being developed in if you were listening to text or getting it from another channel.
Yeah, that kind of makes me question, like, when you're using a diagnostic reading assessment, and it's no surprise that you're referring to these skills on the slide because you were part of that creation of the assessment. I'm wondering, like, how do you differentiate based on grade levels? Like, should we be testing different grade levels differently? And then I also think like that connects to your oral language comment as well.
Well, the design here, and starts from grade around 3 and up here. And so we drew a lot of content from across grades for exactly the reason you said, which is, and I've been saying, which is, well, you're reading different things in 3rd grade and 6th grade and 9th grade. One of the practices that is in comprehension tests that I'm not fully on board with is when they try to strictly limit the varying complexity of text by grade level. Because you can't build a vertical scale if you gave somebody a 3rd grade text and say, well, they scored as if they can read on a 6th grade level. Now going, yeah, but you can give them a 6th grade text. So how do you know that? I mean, and more than that is they can. If you gave that student probably a 6th grade text, they probably, because they have better vocabulary, they have better complexity, and you vary these things. So we tried to draw our items and tasks from a wider range, because again, we know that in middle and high school, you're going to see morphologically complex words. Even our simplest words in any of these tests are not as simple as you'd see usually in K1, 2. They're basically, you're beginning to be a reader of real things in the world. The range, and by the way, I was Harry Potter, average Lexile, I think, maybe any readability is around 5th grade level. I don't think Lexile calls it a grade, but it doesn't matter. So answer this one. It's a trick. It's not a trick question. What do you think paragraph to paragraph is the range of readability of Harry Potter?
Like, can I give you hundreds, or do you want grade levels?
Grade levels, please.
2 grade levels.
So we had a researcher. I'll tell the short story because I know we're running out of time. Basically, we took every 300 words in the entire book. So every every 300 words. It ranges from 2nd to 10th grade level.
Wow.
Basically in a normal distribution. Okay. But guess what? So that's what happens when you stack it, like, okay, this is how many 2nd, this is how many 3rd, this is how many 4th, this is how many 5th. And by the way, we use multi-dimensional readability. So we look at vocabulary as a different dimension, syntactic. All of them vary, just not together. So it's sometimes they're hard syntactically, sometimes hard vocabulary, sometimes both, sometimes. But guess what? It's not like R.K. Rowling wrote this book so that it progressively gets more difficult all the way to the end.
Right.
Every 300 words, you're going like this. You could be going, this could be 2nd grade, this could be 5th grade, this could be 7th grade, this could be 9th. Nobody has a problem. No, children don't have a problem reading Harry Potter because the variation of the difficulty from paragraph to paragraph is so wide. Because that's what reading is. It's language, it's background knowledge, it's other things. So why we trying to constrain that in the assessment design, I don't think is going to be successful. And I don't think it's necessary. So I think yes, there's a limit. I don't want to give everybody the Declaration of Independence to try to decode in 4th grade. But I think we've gone the other direction way too much. So I think text does get more we demand more of students across 3 through 12. The texts are getting, on average, more complex in terms of vocabulary, syntax, the questions we ask, and demands. But we should much more broadly sample from that range in any given assessment. We're not torturing kids. We do some leveling. There's 3 levels there to make sure we're not frustrating kids at any given level, but we're also giving them room to grow within each assessment. And that allows us both to get better measurement and to, I think, cover this kind of range. So, because, by the way, one other last thing is what's happening across the grades. They've always said that there's this flattening out of like skill development. You see it in comprehension tests. That's not what's really happening. What's really happening is that kids who are way down at the bottom aren't growing, so they're still down at the bottom, whereas kids at the top are out here. So basically, you have this wider and wider variation from the bottom to the top, and you see that in reading fluency norms. And guess what? The mean is in the middle still, so it looks like it's flat. But it's not. The top and the bottom are just getting farther and farther apart. And now you have this very wide range. And that's why you need a diagnostic, because you need to know which pieces have now spread out, especially at that bottom level. Because the top ones, again, you're probably less worried, but the lower you get, the more differentiation there may be between the different skill sets.
See, while we're on that topic, I think some of like the most interesting implications of your research to kind of like come out of like creating this diagnostic ReadBasix is really this decoding threshold. So kind of like what you're discussing about student achievement. Can you kind of just share a little bit about what did you find with this decoding threshold and its relationship with comprehension? And I'll stop sharing my screen if you wanted to share a slide on that.
Yeah, sure. I have 2 little slides on that. I think that allow me to tell the story hopefully quicker. So we were doing the development of at the time it was called the RISE. Now it's ReadBasix. And we had the opportunity to work with a particular district, urban district actually, and they let us give this battery 3 times a year, which is now and is typical, and longitudinally over multiple grades. So we just kept going back in and getting new cohorts and then giving new forms and following them along. Well, the consequences, we got a lot of data and a lot of students, but that allowed us to do something that hadn't been done, which is look at the relationship between word recognition and word recognition, decoding, and comprehension. And I'm hoping this thing doesn't keep moving on me. So because we had so much data, we could see something that gets hidden in smaller data sets. If you had a smaller data set, this little technical, you do regression. Well, you only have a few data points in here, so you can't see the line. The line happens across the whole distribution, so it just looks like nothing. But if you have enough data points, you can see that there's actually 2 different lines here. There's a line that's flat, which means all I can tell about your comprehension, and that's below, is it's going to be low, but I can't tell where. There's no linear relationship between how much you decode and comprehension. Whereas above that, the 2 things grow together. And this makes sense because word recognition is part vocabulary, because you're learning more and more words and you're getting better at it. And of course, comprehension. So I don't even know the direction of causality here. The better you are at comprehension, the more words you're reading, the more words you're learning, the better you are at decoding and understanding orthographic patterns, the better you're learning, and vice versa. The better you are at all those things, the more able you are to comprehend, the better you comprehend. So there's a growth curve there, but that was a snapshot. That's the second point here. So we now can follow below and above that line for 3 years. And what we found is, yep, sure enough, if you were above that line, each year as you got better at comprehension, you also got better at decoding, and you grew in both of those at a rate of whatever, 0.6 of whatever the regression equation was. On the other hand, if you were below that line, 3 years later, you didn't grow at all in comprehension. And because in part, and this was an inference, was that it wasn't directly targeted in interventions, and that was probably true at the time in this place, and consequently, without direct remediation of any kind, you couldn't read words better, which means you couldn't comprehend passages that are getting harder and harder and more complex, et cetera, better. So we published that in the Journal of Educational Psychology, and yeah, we think it's important. And that cut point, it may. Oh, the other thing I forgot is the same cut point on our scale was true for 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade. That is, it was like an absolute threshold. If you were below it, whatever grade on the scale, that was still a very strong indicator that you couldn't read. So that's the decoding threshold hypothesis.
Yeah, and I think that's such a powerful piece of information for teachers, especially when you get into middle school and high school. Like that is imperative to support students with, so that they can increase.
Yeah, we're so used to, or the testing community is so kind of gotten us used to this idea of continuous things, and it's true, a lot of these are continuous, but actionable things also have to do with having good cut points. Now there's probabilities around those cut points, so it's still complicated, but again, if you want to take an action, you need some idea of where the critical points are. And a lot of our research in the last year since this has looked for that in background knowledge and in other domains. So we're saying, well, can we at least find a couple inflection points here where, at it, you're a little bit uncertain, but way below it, you're definitely certain something needs to be done, and way above it, you may not have to worry as much.
Yeah, I think this is a great opportunity to transition into actually showing ReadBasix. So would you mind if I can share the screen? Okay, perfect. Sure. Thank you. All right. So now I'm going to take us into CAPTI and show a little bit of ReadBasix. So here we are. I've gone to captivoice.com and I'm in the login. All right, let me get my login here. Okay, so just to contextualize this a little bit, so Dr. Sabatini worked with the IES Reading for Understanding Initiative and with a team at ETS, and the outcome is ReadBasix. At the time, it was called RISE, and if I misspeak at all, Dr. Sabatini, please let me know. Yep. All right, so I'm going in and I want to show you how to create a new assignment just so that you can see that each of the subtests, so each of the foundational reading skills, is an individual subtest. So you can actually measure students' skills in any combination. What is great is if you wanted to spend just a certain amount of time on a test, you can see how much time is needed for each of the subtests. And as you click that time here also increases. If you did the whole battery, it's predicted to be about 76 minutes. But the first 5 subtests are actually 9 minutes or less is the projected time. So after students complete the assessment, you do really get some meaningful data. So as you go into your students, you're going to be able to, first of all, get a profile of students, see if they are low, medium, or high, and that's correlated to how they did on the subtest. So if most of the subtests, they were around the medium level of performance, then they get the medium profile. There's also these notable profiles, and these are students who tested at extremes within the subtest. So it could be that they tested really high in word recognition and decoding and really low in reading comprehension, or vice versa, really low in word recognition and decoding and really high in comprehension. And that kind of signals that there might be some type of underlying issue that might not be identified. Within the reports too, you get the scale score. So there are 4 levels here, so 4 performance levels. Red is the weak performance level, and this one here is word recognition and decoding. If a student is weak, that means that they are below the word or the decoding threshold, which Dr. Sabatini was just talking about. So that would definitely warrant some type of intervention to support students in their word recognition and decoding. You get those results across each of the subtests. And then you also get grade equivalency and then RTI tier recommendations. And these you can actually customize based on the amount of funding you have for providing intervention to really support students at your school or within your classroom. And then once you go into students, you get you can see the scores, grade equivalency or percentile, and you can also sort each of these columns to support with creating groups. So here again, you could see I sorted by word recognition and decoding. I can see everybody in this 7th grade class and see who's below that threshold. And
So
who
I want to jump in just a second because this has come up a lot in discussions. There are occasions, we've just always seen this in the data, which is like the one here that where you see there's like 4 greens and yet it falls down with the word recognition decoding.
Yep.
You will find some students who, for whatever reason, don't do well on the word recognition decoding, but are otherwise doing really well. And I do think, that warrants kind of looking and see what happens. Sometimes they just didn't understand. I don't want to say understand, but they didn't respond well to the particular word recognition test. If you're completely confident that they're very good at all the other things, that's the only case I've seen where you can sort of take with a grain of salt the word recognition decoding. So I think that's why it's important to look at the profile. On the other hand, the top profile here, where they're really bad at all the word level tasks in a row, and you compensate. So once you get more text, you can use all the information. The good and bad news about reading a passage is you can bring all the skills in at once. You can use your background knowledge, you can use inferences, you can sort of connect ideas. It's like when I try to read Italian, if you give me a passage, I might make sense of it. If you give me 3 words, I'm doomed because I don't know those 3 words, I can't do anything. So that's a profile that's bad for growth because the underlying foundations are weak. So how can you sustain that as more text, more vocabulary, more things? So that's the one where you really want to get in there and help the word level engine to be better. And then you'll see those others growing faster, better, and with it. On the other hand, as I said, that other profile where it looks like everything else might be good. Now, that's not great scores, the green area. So but I mean, I think I'd look differently at that profile because it could have just been something weird about that particular test and that day. I'm sorry, I just thought this was so exciting to see the profiles.
Yes. Well, thanks.
And that's why I can compliment the entire back engine score reporting part of this system is phenomenal. I mean, we have others who use it, and it's rich. It gets richer each iteration that you put into a version. So I think it's at first somebody might use it and go, wow, it's too much information. But I think in the long run, teachers, schools, others, once they understand how to take advantage of rich information, are grateful to have it all.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Thanks for your input on that. So I am looking at time, and I would like to just mention that if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A or in the chat. I am just going to quickly show one final piece of, I guess it's 2 final pieces of information here. This is the student summative report. So you get really detailed information. Here's Lexile, and then you get individual subtests. You'll see results here that tell what the student can do and then what they would benefit from. But we also have a list of recommendations based on performance level. So these performance levels have some steps to take to support students in reaching toward the next proficiency level. And with that, I'm going to stop and just open it up for questions. Okay, we have one in the Q&A. All right, so we have a question. It says, how do we identify if an assessment is aligned to the science of reading?
I guess you need to know the science of reading. I mean, that what I just described to you, oh, okay. Well, let's start at the beginning. The thing that became called the science of reading started with the National Reading Panel report, which had identified 5 major components: phonological awareness, decoding, fluency, vocabulary, reading comprehension strategies. The whole notion of science of reading is that it's science, so we evolve and we change. So but those 5 areas still sort of hold up. I think the phonological awareness is now, it has a narrower scope for early reading and is embedded into the decoding one. The morphology one is could be thought of as a split off and recent. And so these are research based. So the answer is it's all research based. The research does change. I think one of the areas we've been studying, for example, is background knowledge. The other area I mentioned is there's a lot of work saying, well, early elementary students really need to develop their language skills in parallel, but separate, because they can't read well. In other words, a 3rd grader can understand a whole lot more than they can actually understand when they read. So why would you be limiting them to only what they can read? So I mean, the science goes on, and if you understand that science, you would understand that we need to keep evolving our assessments to keep up with it. And we've been doing that in our research. I think this is, and I know coming soon from CAPTI is our scenario-based work, which focuses much more on comprehension strategies and higher order kind of, applications of things. And that's the only answer. It's like, it's science of reading as long as it's, aligned well with what the last level of solid science was.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. I think that is helpful, just to refer back to determining what the science of reading really tells us, to be able to equip yourself to be able to find those assessments that do align with it.
And demand them, whether it's from you guys or us, because I think, we've always felt that the assessment companies become complacent. They're like, well, if people keep buying it, we'll keep doing it the same way we always did. And I don't think that's good enough. And I think that's actually a problem right now in a lot of K-12 and other work, is that they're not evolving the assessments to keep up with the instruction. So people stop doing good instruction so they can give people a test that isn't matched up with it. And so we need to keep changing the tests at the same rate we change quality instruction. And that actually requires some market demand, because how else are we going to get them to change if they're still making money on what they were selling before?
Yes, good point. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sabatini. I really appreciate your insight into diagnostic reading assessments and really helping us to equip ourselves with how to find those and use them. So I just want to mention that Dr. Sabatini has a website that you can find out more about what he's doing within all of his projects. He has a lot of projects going on, all very interesting. So you can find those at his website. And then we also have the director of sales up on the screen, Erica. She is ready to answer any questions you might have further about CAPTI and ReadBasix. So thank you so much for attending this webinar. And thank you, Dr. Sabatini.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been great. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things.
Yes, thanks so much.
Bye.